July 7, 1944. 3 a.m. Northern Saipan, Mariana Islands. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Hogaboom of the 2nd Marine Division stood on a ridge overlooking the moonlit terrain of northern Saipan. The harsh white light of battlefield illumination flares revealed a landscape transformed by war. Shattered palm trees, bomb craters, and the twisted remains of Japanese fortifications. Below him, American forces had established a defensive line stretching across the island's narrow waist. Behind that line, hundreds of artillery pieces, 105mm and 155mm howitzers, sat in carefully surveyed positions. "They'll come tonight," Hogaboom told his artillery coordinator, Major William Chamberlain. "All intelligence points to a major attack before dawn." Chamberlain nodded grimly. "All batteries are registered on predetermined coordinates, Colonel. Time-on-target protocols are in place. If they come in force, they'll walk into the heaviest concentration of artillery fire ever deployed in the Pacific, in Hidui-sa." What both men understood, and what the Japanese command had fatally failed to grasp, was that the nature of warfare had fundamentally changed. The Japanese army still adhered to a doctrine that emphasized spiritual power, human courage, and the supremacy of the infantry charge. The Americans, by contrast, had evolved a doctrine that leveraged their overwhelming industrial capacity, technical expertise, and firepower coordination. The Japanese forces on Saipan, commanded by Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, were the remnants of the 43rd Division, once among Japan's elite units. Now, after 3 weeks of brutal fighting, they had been pushed into the island's northern corner. Ammunition was low, food nearly exhausted, and medical supplies non-existent. "We have only one direction to go," General Saito had told his officers earlier that evening. "That direction is forward. We will advance to destroy the American invaders, or die honorably in the attempt." Japanese military culture had evolved from the Bushido code, the way of the warrior, which emphasized loyalty, honor, and fearlessness in the face of death. Their infantry tactics emphasized close combat, night attacks, and aggressive bayonet charges designed to overwhelm enemy positions through shock and spiritual superiority. This approach had proven successful against Chinese forces in the 1930s and initially against Western colonial forces in 1941 and 42. But by 1944, American industrial production had reached levels that Japanese planners had considered impossible. Major General Saito had witnessed this disparity firsthand during the 3-week battle for the island. His diary, recovered after the battle, revealed his growing realization: "The Americans bring fresh troops daily, while my men have fought continuously without relief. They replace damaged tanks within hours. Their artillery fires without apparent concern for ammunition shortages. This is not merely a battle against American soldiers, it is a battle against American factories." On the American side, Lieutenant General Holland M. Smith, commanding the expeditionary forces, had recognized the pattern of Japanese final stands culminating in desperate charges. Unlike earlier Pacific battles, however, Smith now had unprecedented artillery resources at his disposal. Over 200 artillery pieces with ample ammunition supplies constantly replenished by the massive fleet offshore. "We will not defeat fanaticism with matching sacrifice," Smith told his division commanders. "We will defeat it with firepower, coordination, and industrial capacity." Planning and Expectations, June 15, 1944. Imperial General Headquarters, Tokyo, Japan. General Hideki Tojo, Prime Minister and Chief of the Imperial Japanese Army General Staff, studied the large wall map showing the advancing American forces across the Pacific. The pattern was unmistakable: a steady, methodical advance toward the Japanese home islands. Saipan must not fall. Tojo told the assembled staff officers, "It is the inner defensive line of our sacred homeland. The garrison there will fight to the last man." What Tojo failed to comprehend was how dramatically the material balance had shifted. In 1941, Japan had possessed rough naval parity with American forces in the Pacific. By mid-1944, American shipyards were launching a new aircraft carrier every 2 weeks. Japanese shipyards struggled to complete a single carrier in a year. This industrial disparity extended to every category of war materiel. Japanese artillery production for 1944 would total approximately 1,200 guns of all calibers. The United States would produce over 17,000 artillery pieces in the same period. Japanese monthly artillery ammunition production had fallen to less than 300,000 rounds, while American factories produced over 4 million rounds monthly. On Saipan, Lieutenant General Saito received Imperial Headquarters orders with stoic acceptance. "We will defend to the last man," he responded by secure radio. But privately, he confided his concerns to his Chief of Staff, Colonel Takashi Omai. "Our men will fight bravely, but our ammunition supplies are limited," Saito noted. "The Americans fire more artillery shells in a single day than we have on the entire island." Despite these daunting odds, Japanese planning proceeded according to traditional doctrine. The 43rd Division would conduct a defense in depth, using Saipan's mountainous terrain to maximum advantage. When American forces became extended and vulnerable, local counterattacks would drive them back into the sea. This planning reflected Japanese military orthodoxy, an emphasis on spiritual strength, tactical skill, and willingness to sacrifice. It disregarded the material realities that increasingly dominated modern warfare. On the American side, planning reflected hard-won experience from earlier Pacific campaigns. Lieutenant General Holland emphasized the integration of all supporting arms to minimize infantry casualties. "Artillery will be our primary offensive weapon," Smith instructed his division commanders. "We will saturate Japanese positions before sending in infantry. Every attack will have overwhelming fire support." Colonel Arthur Chalacombe, Smith's artillery coordinator, developed an unprecedented fire support plan for Saipan. "We're bringing more artillery to this operation than any previous Pacific engagement," he explained. 224 artillery pieces with over 500,000 rounds, enough to sustain maximum fire rates for 20 days. Major William Chamberlain developed innovative time-on-target techniques that would prove devastating. Time-on-target, TOT, coordinated multiple batteries to ensure their shells arrived simultaneously on the target, regardless of different firing distances. This multiplication of effect created both physical and psychological shock far greater than the same number of shells arriving sequentially. When properly executed, Chamberlain explained to his battery commanders, "A time-on-target mission delivers all shells within a 3-second impact window. The enemy experiences a sudden, overwhelming explosion rather than a steady bombardment they might adapt to." This technical innovation represented the American approach to warfare, using industrial capacity, technical expertise, and systematic organization to multiply combat effectiveness. It stood in stark contrast to the Japanese emphasis on spiritual strength and personal sacrifice. Intelligence and Preparations, June 30, 1944. G2 Intelligence, Section, Headquarters, Northern Troops and Landing Force, Saipan. Colonel Thomas Colliday, intelligence officer for Lieutenant General Holland Smith's command, spread a collection of intercepted Japanese communications on the conference table. Around him, intelligence analysts and Japanese language specialists examined the documents with intense concentration. "These were recovered from a dead messenger near Mount Tapochau yesterday," Colliday explained to General Smith. "They appear to be orders from General Saito to his remaining unit commanders. Smith picked up the translated summary. "So they're planning a final attack?" Colliday nodded. "The documents suggest they're consolidating their remaining forces in the northern part of the island. Saito has ordered all civilians and wounded to commit suicide rather than surrender. He appears to be planning what they call a gyokusai, a shattered jewel attack. Essentially, a mass charge designed to penetrate our lines. This intelligence confirmed patterns seen in earlier island battles. Japanese forces, when facing inevitable defeat, typically launched all-out attacks rather than surrendering. These Banzai charges, named for the battle cry "Tenno Heika Banzai," or "Long Live the Emperor," reflected the Japanese military code that considered surrender dishonorable. What made Saipan different was the scale of potential attack and the American preparations to meet it. Previous Banzai charges had involved hundreds of troops. Intelligence estimates suggested the Saipan attack could involve thousands, possibly the largest such attack of the Pacific War. Colonel Robert Hogaboom, operations officer for the 2nd Marine Division, used this intelligence to develop a defensive plan specifically designed to counter a mass infantry attack. The American lines were drawn across a relatively narrow portion of the island, anchored on both coasts. Artillery positions were established in depth, with carefully surveyed firing data for all likely approach routes. "We've established primary defensive positions here," Hogaboom explained to his battalion commanders, indicating a line on the map. "But our real defense is our artillery. We've created interlocking fields of pre-registered fire covering every approach to our positions." Major William Chamberlain, the artillery coordinator, had divided the entire northern portion of the island into numbered grid squares. Each square had predetermined firing data for every battery. When Japanese forces were observed in any grid, they could deliver immediate fire from multiple batteries simultaneously. Each 105mm battery has 4,000 rounds available, Chamberlain noted. Each 150mm battery has 2,500 rounds. We can sustain maximum fire rates for hours if necessary. On the Japanese side, Lieutenant General Saito, recognizing that conventional defense had become impossible, determined to make a final gesture that would salvage Japanese honor and inflict maximum damage on American forces. On July 6th, Saito issued his final orders to the assembled officers. "There is no longer any distinction between civilians and soldiers. Every Japanese on this island has the duty to fight to the death. We will advance together to destroy the American positions. Each man will kill at least 10 Americans before dying." Following this meeting, Saito and several senior officers committed ritual suicide, seppuku. Command of the planned attack passed to Colonel Takashi Ohmai, who would lead the remaining Japanese forces in their final charge. Throughout July 6th, Japanese troops prepared for the attack. Remaining ammunition was distributed, with each soldier receiving a full combat load. Sake rations, saved for this moment, were distributed to bolster morale and courage. The plan called for the attack to begin at 4 a.m. on July 7th, during the darkest hours before dawn. The main force would advance southward along the island's central axis, with smaller forces moving along both coastal roads. The objective was to penetrate American lines, reach the artillery positions, and destroy as many guns as possible before being killed. American intelligence detected these preparations through multiple sources. By early evening on July 6th, American forces had completed their own preparations. Infantry units were at 100% alert status, with extra ammunition distributed to all positions. Artillery batteries had doubled their ready ammunition at gun positions. Naval gunfire support ships had moved into position offshore, prepared to deliver supporting fire on prearranged coordinates. As night fell across Saipan, Thousands of men on both sides waited for the coming confrontation. For the Japanese, it represented the culmination of their military tradition, a chance for an honorable death in service to emperor and nation. For the Americans, it would be the supreme test of their new doctrine of industrial warfare, using overwhelming firepower to negate enemy courage and sacrifice. Opening actions, July 7, 1944, 2:30 a.m. Northern Saipan. The night was unusually quiet. American forward observers, positioned in foxholes beyond the main defensive line, sensed the unnatural stillness. Through their field telephones, they reported their unease to command posts. "Something's coming," Sergeant Frank Maloney whispered into his handset. "I can feel them moving out there." In the pre-dawn darkness, thousands of Japanese soldiers were moving into position. They advanced silently, having been ordered to maintain absolute noise discipline until the attack began. The main attack force, approximately 3,000 men, had assembled in a ravine 700 yards north of American lines. Smaller forces of 800 to 1,000 men each were positioned to attack along both coastal roads. Colonel Omai moved among his men, offering final encouragement. "Remember the words of General Saito," he told them. "Each man must kill at least 10 Americans. Fight for the Emperor and for our homeland." At the American command post, Lieutenant Colonel Hogaboom received increasingly urgent reports from forward observers. "Multiple units reporting movement sounds to our front," his operations sergeant reported. Hogaboom nodded grimly. "Alert all units, 100% readiness, and notify artillery to prepare for maximum sustained fire on pre-registered coordinates." Major Chamberlain, at the Artillery Fire Direction Center, began issuing preliminary orders to the battery commanders. "Prepare for time-on-target missions. Grid sectors 4 through 11 may be engaged within the next 30 minutes. Ensure maximum ready ammunition at all gun positions." At precisely 4 a.m., the remaining Japanese artillery, just 7 operational mountain guns, fired their opening salvos. Almost immediately, the Japanese infantry began to move forward. At first, they maintained tactical discipline, advancing in extended formation, using terrain features for cover. But as they approached American lines, the war cry, "Banzai, Banzai," erupted from thousands of throats. What had begun as an infiltration attempt transformed into the classic Banzai charge, a human wave attack driven by emotion and spiritual fervor rather than tactical calculation. In the American forward positions, the scene was both terrifying and surreal. Private Robert McCall, in a forward listening post, later described the moment. "First we heard the shouting, distant at first, then growing louder. Then we saw them coming through the darkness, hundreds, maybe thousands of shadowy figures running toward us. Some had rifles with bayonets fixed. Others carried swords, or even sharpened bamboo spears. They were shouting 'Banzai' over and over." Forward observers immediately called in their sightings. Within seconds, Major Chamberlain's Fire Direction Center began issuing fire missions to the artillery batteries. The first shells were in the air less than 60 seconds after the Japanese charge began. "Fire mission, battery, grid square 5 alpha. Time on target 04:05. 4 rounds, high explosive." The commands echoed across the artillery positions as gun crews leapt into action. The pre-registered coordinates meant minimal adjustments were needed. The guns were already laid on their targets. At 4:05 a.m., the first coordinated time-on-target mission struck the advancing Japanese. Over 100 artillery shells from multiple batteries landed simultaneously in a space roughly 400 yards square. The effect was devastating. Dozens of Japanese soldiers disappeared in the explosions, while many more were wounded by shrapnel. Yet the charge continued. Surviving Japanese soldiers moved around or through the impact area, maintaining their momentum toward American lines. Their advance triggered additional fire missions, creating a rolling barrage that tracked their movement. Lieutenant Toshio Sakurai, one of the few Japanese officers who survived the attack, later described the scene, "We ran through hell itself. The entire earth erupted around us. Men vanished in explosions. The noise was beyond description, not individual detonations, but a continuous roar of destruction." By 4:15 a.m., the first wave of Japanese attackers had reached the American forward positions. Despite horrific casualties from artillery fire, several hundred Japanese soldiers engaged in desperate hand-to-hand combat with American defenders. The fighting was brutal and intimate. Rifle butts against samurai swords, bayonets against combat knives. Private James Sullivan of the 25th Marine Regiment described one such encounter. "A Japanese officer came straight at me with a sword. I fired twice, but he kept coming. We crashed together and went down fighting. It was him or me, the most primal kind of fighting imaginable." Yet even as these close combats raged, American firepower continued to shape the battle. Artillery fire had shifted to deeper targets, destroying follow-on Japanese forces before they could reach the forward positions. Naval gunfire from destroyers offshore targeted the Japanese flanking movements along the coastal roads. And American machine guns delivered interlocking fields of fire that cut down Japanese soldiers by the dozens. The mathematics of industrial warfare were playing out with ruthless efficiency. Each American machine gun could deliver up to 500 rounds per minute. Each artillery battery could fire 10 to 15 rounds per minute per gun. The 12-inch guns on supporting destroyers could deliver a shell every 15 seconds. Against this hurricane of steel, the Japanese had only their courage, their bayonets, and their increasingly futile determination. By 4:30 a.m., the first Japanese attack wave had been largely destroyed. Of the approximately 3,000 soldiers in the main attack force, fewer than 500 had reached American lines. Yet, the attack continued, with secondary waves moving forward over the bodies of their fallen comrades. As dawn began to illuminate the battlefield around 5 a.m., the ground between the original Japanese positions and American lines was literally carpeted with bodies. Thousands of Japanese soldiers who had been cut down by artillery, naval gunfire, and machine guns. Yet, remarkably, the attack continued, with smaller groups and individual soldiers still attempting to reach American positions. The American response remained methodical and overwhelmingly powerful. Artillery fire continued at maximum sustained rates, with gun barrels becoming so hot they had to be cooled with water between firing cycles. Machine gunners changed barrels repeatedly as they overheated from continuous fire. By 6 a.m., the Japanese attack had been shattered. Of the approximately 4,500 soldiers who had participated, over 4,000 were dead. The survivors, many wounded, had fallen back to final defensive positions in caves along the northern coast. The largest Banzai attack of the Pacific War had been systematically destroyed by coordinated American firepower. Lieutenant Colonel Hogaboom surveyed the battlefield from his command post as full daylight revealed the scale of the carnage. "My God," he said quietly to Major Chamberlain, "they just kept coming, no matter how many we killed." Chamberlain nodded grimly. "Artillery fired over 20,000 rounds in less than 2 hours. The 155 batteries are down to their reserve ammunition. I have never seen such expenditure rates." What neither man fully articulated, but both understood, was that they had witnessed the collision of two incompatible approaches to warfare. Japanese spiritual warfare against American industrial warfare. The outcome had demonstrated with brutal clarity which approach would prevail. The critical moment, July 7, 1944. 6:30 a.m. Northern Saipan. The rising sun illuminated a landscape transformed by industrial violence. What had been a contested battleground was now an open-air charnel house. Thousands of Japanese bodies carpeted the ground between their former positions and the American lines. Medical teams moved cautiously through the carnage, checking for survivors and collecting intelligence materials from the bodies of officers. Major General Thomas Watson, commanding the 2nd Marine Division, arrived at Lieutenant Colonel Hogaboom's command post for a first-hand assessment. The two officers walked to a forward observation point where the full scale of the Japanese attack and its destruction was visible. "How many do you estimate, Colonel?" Watson asked, surveying the field of bodies. "Intelligence puts the total at 4,500 in the attack force, sir. We've counted over 4,000 dead so far. There may be some wounded who crawled back to their lines, but not many." Watson nodded silently. Even for veterans of Pacific combat, the scale of destruction was sobering. What made this moment critical wasn't just the tactical victory, but the revelation it provided about the fundamental nature of modern warfare. "They never had a chance, did they?" Watson said quietly. "No, sir," Hogaboom replied. "Not against coordinated artillery. The infantry engagement was almost secondary. Most were killed before they reached our lines." This was the critical moment of revelation, when both sides fully understood that courage and spiritual strength, no matter how profound, could not overcome industrial firepower. The Japanese had launched their attack believing that sufficient sacrifice could achieve victory. The Americans had responded with a demonstration of firepower that rendered such sacrifice futile. Major Chamberlain joined the officers, carrying the artillery expenditure reports. "Final count on ammunition expended, sir. 23,400 rounds in 2 hours. The naval gunfire adds another 2,500 heavy shells. Nothing like this has ever been seen in the Pacific theater." The mathematics were stark. Each Japanese soldier who had participated in the attack had, on average, more than 5 artillery shells directed specifically at him. The industrial differential between America and Japan had manifested in the most direct way possible. Thousands of tons of steel and explosives produced by American factories had physically eliminated Japanese combat power. Captain James Reynolds, an artillery forward observer who had directed much of the fire, later described the critical turning point. When the first wave was hit by time-on-target fire, there was a moment when the Japanese attack visibly faltered. You could see the survivors hesitate, confronted with a level of firepower they'd never experienced. But then, they continued forward anyway, directly into more barrages. It wasn't just courage. It was a different conception of warfare entirely, one that no longer had any place on the modern battlefield. For Japanese officers observing from their command positions, the moment was equally revealing but far more devastating. Lieutenant Toshio Sakurai, one of the few survivors, recorded in his diary, "We had been told Americans were soft, lacking in spiritual strength. But they didn't need spiritual strength. Their machines killed us before we could reach them to test their fighting spirit. It was not a battle between men, but a battle between men and machines. The machines won." By 7 a.m., the full magnitude of the Japanese defeat was apparent. American casualties from the entire night action numbered less than 100 killed and 300 wounded, most from the brief period of hand-to-hand combat when Japanese soldiers reached the forward positions. Against this, the Japanese had lost over 4,000 dead, nearly their entire remaining combat strength on the island. The critical revelation extended beyond the tactical level to the strategic. American commanders now understood that Japanese forces, when pushed to extremity, would launch mass attacks that could be defeated through preparation and firepower. Japanese survivors realized that no amount of spiritual strength or personal sacrifice could overcome the industrial gap that had opened between the two nations. Major General Holland, arriving at the scene mid-morning, grasped the wider implications immediately. "This is the beginning of the end for the Japanese Empire," he told his staff. "They've shown us their ultimate tactic, the willingness to sacrifice everything in a frontal assault. We've shown them that even this, their final card, is insufficient against American industrial power." Immediate aftermath and perspective. July 8th through 20th, 1944. Saipan and beyond. The day after the failed Banzai attack, American forces advanced cautiously northward, encountering only scattered resistance. Most remaining Japanese soldiers, having witnessed the destruction of their main force, chose individual suicide rather than surrender. Civilians, indoctrinated to fear American captivity, jumped from cliffs or killed themselves with grenades. By July 9th, organized Japanese resistance had effectively ended, though the island was not declared secured until July 20th. For American forces, the aftermath brought mixed emotions. There was pride in victory and relief at surviving, but also shock at the scale of death they had witnessed and inflicted. Private First Class Robert McCall, who had been in a forward listening post when the attack began, wrote home, "I don't know how to explain what we saw. Thousands of men running directly into certain death, knowing they couldn't win but coming anyway. It makes you wonder what kind of enemy we're fighting, and what it will take to end this war." The technical aftermath was equally significant. Artillery units conducted detailed analyses of ammunition expenditure, fire coordination, and effectiveness. The results were incorporated into revised doctrine that would guide operations for the remainder of the Pacific War. The time-on-target technique, pioneered by Major Chamberlain, was refined and standardized, becoming a cornerstone of American artillery tactics. Major William Rogers, an artillery officer who studied the battle extensively for the War Department, concluded, "The Saipan Banzai attack demonstrated that the Japanese conception of warfare had become fundamentally obsolete. No amount of courage or spiritual strength could overcome the coordinated application of industrial firepower. The mathematical imbalance was simply too great." On the Japanese side, the few survivors who eventually returned to Japan brought a perspective that shattered military orthodoxy. Lieutenant Toshio Sakurai, after recovering from wounds, reported to Imperial headquarters, "The Americans did not defeat us through superior fighting spirit or tactical skill. They defeated us through machinery, coordination, and ammunition supply. Against their artillery, the bravest charge is futile." Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai, one of the more clear-eyed members of the Japanese High Command, recognized the implications immediately. In a private memo circulated among senior officers, he wrote, "The Americans have demonstrated they can produce ammunition faster than we can produce soldiers. No tactical or spiritual advantage can overcome this fundamental industrial imbalance." For frontline Japanese officers in other theaters, the reports from Saipan were professionally devastating. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack and was now serving as a staff officer, later recalled, "When we received the reports of the Saipan battle, many of us realized for the first time that no amount of sacrifice or spiritual strength could overcome the industrial gap. Some officers refused to accept this reality, but those of us who had seen American production facilities firsthand understood the truth." Perhaps the most poignant perspective came from ordinary Japanese soldiers who had witnessed the destruction. Corporal Kenji Matsuhara, who survived by hiding in a cave after being wounded early in the attack, wrote in his diary, "We charged forward shouting Banzai, believing our spirit would overcome American materiel. But spirit cannot stop an artillery shell. The ground erupted around us, and men simply disappeared. It was not combat as we had been taught to understand it. It was industrial slaughter." American war correspondents struggled to convey the scale and nature of the battle to the public. Robert Sherrod, reporting for Time magazine, wrote, "What happened on Saipan was not a battle in any traditional sense. It was the systematic destruction of human beings by machinery. The Japanese soldiers displayed courage beyond anything I have witnessed, but it was utterly futile against coordinated American firepower. The age of the heroic charge is over, replaced by the mathematics of industrial production." For military planners on both sides, the battle forced a fundamental reassessment. American planners recognized that Japanese forces would likely continue such suicidal tactics, but now had proven methods to counter them with minimal friendly casualties. Japanese planners faced the more devastating realization that their entire approach to warfare had been rendered obsolete by industrial reality. Strategic consequences. July through December 1944. Pacific Theater and Japan. The strategic consequences of the Saipan Banzai charge and its destruction extended far beyond the immediate tactical outcome. The battle represented a decisive moment when Japanese military leaders were forced to confront the full implications of American industrial superiority. In Tokyo, the fall of Saipan triggered the collapse of Prime Minister Hideki Tojo's government on July 18th. The magnitude of the defeat, particularly the complete destruction of the final Banzai attack, demonstrated that Japan's traditional military virtues were insufficient against American productive capacity. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, summarized the strategic reality in a report to the new government. "The Americans can replace everything we destroy. We can replace nothing they destroy. Each day their production increases while ours decreases. This is not a matter of fighting spirit or tactical skill, but of industrial capacity." The most immediate strategic consequence was the implementation of lessons learned on both sides. American forces refined their defensive preparations for subsequent island battles, creating pre-registered artillery fire zones and establishing ammunition stockpiles that would enable sustained maximum fire rates. Japanese forces increasingly shifted to defensive tactics focused on maximizing American casualties rather than achieving victory, a tacit acknowledgement that offensive operations had become suicidal. On Peleliu in September 1944, Japanese defenders abandoned the Banzai tactics that had failed on Saipan, instead adopting a defense in depth using caves and concrete bunkers. This change in approach dramatically increased American casualties, but did not change the ultimate outcome. The Japanese could delay defeat, but not prevent it. The industrial mathematics that had been demonstrated on Saipan's bloodied landscape continued to worsen for Japan. By late 1944, American factories were producing 700 combat aircraft monthly for Pacific operations alone, more than Japan's entire remaining inventory. Artillery production had reached 2,000 pieces monthly, with 20 million shells to feed them. Major General Curtis LeMay, who would later direct the strategic bombing of Japan, observed, "What happened on Saipan was the physical manifestation of industrial statistics. 4,000 rounds of artillery ammunition equals 1,000 dead enemy soldiers. This is not a matter of courage or fighting spirit. It is industrial mathematics." For Japanese strategic planners, the Saipan experience forced a fundamental reassessment. Admiral Onishi Takejiro, who would later conceive the kamikaze program, explicitly cited the Saipan Banzai charge in his proposal. Traditional infantry tactics have been rendered obsolete by American firepower. We must find asymmetric approaches that maximize the spiritual strength of our people, while minimizing exposure to overwhelming American material superiority. The kamikazes represented Japan's strategic response to the lesson of Saipan, an attempt to find a form of spiritual warfare that could still be effective against industrial opponents. By converting pilots and aircraft into guided missiles, the Japanese hoped to achieve impact disproportionate to their material investment. But even this approach would ultimately fail against the overwhelming productive capacity of American industry. Perhaps the most significant strategic consequence was the impact on planning for the invasion of the Japanese home islands. American planners, studying the Saipan battle and subsequent Japanese defensive adaptations, calculated potential casualties for an invasion of Kyushu and Honshu. The projected American losses, hundreds of thousands of casualties, would significantly influence the decision to use atomic weapons instead of invasion. General George Marshall, reviewing these projections, specifically cited the Saipan experience. The Japanese have demonstrated they will fight to the last man, rather than surrender. On their home soil, with civilian participation, this tendency will be magnified. We must expect resistance similar to the Saipan Banzai charge, but on a national scale. By December 1944, the transformation in warfare revealed at Saipan had been fully incorporated into American strategic thinking. Future operations would maximize firepower and minimize infantry exposure. Artillery expenditure would increase rather than decrease, with planning factors allowing for 10 times the pre-Saipan ammunition allocation. Naval gunfire support would be expanded, with more ships assigned to each landing and longer pre-invasion bombardments. The mathematics of industrial warfare had been demonstrated with brutal clarity on Saipan, and neither side could ignore its implications. The Japanese Banzai charge, once a fearsome manifestation of Bushido spirit, had been revealed as tragically obsolete against the coordinated application of American industrial might. Epilogue, April 5, 1945. War Department, Washington, D.C. Major General Thomas Watson, now serving on the Joint Planning Staff after commanding the 2nd Marine Division on Saipan, reviewed the latest intelligence assessments of Japanese defensive preparations on Okinawa. The reports indicated extensive underground fortifications, artillery positions hardened against counter-battery fire, and an apparent absence of plans for large-scale Banzai attacks. "They've learned from Saipan," Watson noted to his planning staff. "They've abandoned the tactics that failed them there. Now they're focusing entirely on making our victory as costly as possible." The lesson of Saipan, that spiritual warfare could not overcome industrial firepower, had been fully absorbed by both sides. For American planners, it reinforced the approach of using overwhelming material superiority to minimize casualties. For Japanese planners, it forced a shift from offensive to defensive tactics, seeking to make each American advance as costly as possible in hopes of eventually breaking American will. The symbolic meaning of the Saipan Banzai charge and its destruction extended beyond the immediate military implications. It represented the collision of two irreconcilable approaches to warfare and to the modern world itself. The Japanese approach, rooted in traditional values of spiritual strength, personal courage, and willingness to sacrifice, had been physically shattered by the American approach of industrial production, technical coordination, and material abundance. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Hogaboom, who had witnessed the attack firsthand, later reflected, "What we saw that night was more than a military engagement. It was the end of an era." For centuries, warfare had been primarily a contest of human courage and skill. At Saipan, it became clear that modern war is primarily a contest of production capacity and technical coordination. The individual soldier, no matter how brave or skilled, had become secondary to the machinery of industrial warfare. Soldiers, this transformation would shape military thinking long after World War II ended. The emphasis on firepower coordination, technical superiority, and industrial capacity would dominate American military doctrine through the Cold War and beyond. The lesson of Saipan, that courage without supporting firepower is futile, would be incorporated into training at every level. For Japan, the legacy was more complex and painful. The sacrifice of thousands of soldiers in a futile charge represented both the height of traditional Bushido values and their ultimate failure against industrial modernity. Post-war Japan would embrace industrial production and technical innovation, the very qualities that had defeated them, while preserving aspects of their traditional culture in transformed contexts. Some of the American officers who witnessed the Saipan charge would later express a complex mixture of respect for Japanese courage and horror at its futility. Colonel Gerald Thomas, who commanded the 6th Marine Regiment during the battle, wrote in his memoirs, "They came at us with a courage that bordered on madness. In any other era of warfare, such determination might have carried the day. But against coordinated artillery fire, it was simply suicide. You couldn't help admiring their spirit while being appalled by the waste of life." The long-term significance of the Saipan battle extended beyond military affairs to shape the emerging post-war world. The demonstration that industrial capacity was now the primary determinant of military power influenced everything from Cold War strategy to economic development policies. Nations increasingly measured their security not by the courage of their soldiers, but by the productivity of their factories. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, perhaps best captured the essential lesson in a report to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The Battle of Saipan demonstrated conclusively that courage, no matter how fanatical, cannot overcome coordinated firepower. The Japanese soldiers who charged our lines were among the bravest men I've encountered in warfare. But bravery alone is no longer sufficient on the modern battlefield. The Japanese have learned this lesson at terrible cost. We must ensure we never forget it. 75 years later, the sacrifice of thousands of Japanese soldiers in the Saipan Banzai charge stands as both a monument to human courage and a demonstration of its limits against industrial warfare. The collision between spiritual and industrial approaches to warfare was resolved definitively on that blood-soaked island, establishing patterns